Last time we learned about how the speed of sound is the same for all frequencies, but it changes based upon the conditions of the air. Well, one of you asked an insightful curiosity question, like what would happen if a bat was in, say, a cold, damp cave? Would the speed of sound affect its echolocation abilities? So let's take a look at this question. We know that the speed of sound does vary with the temperature of the air. I told you that. But I didn't tell you which way. Which do you think has faster sound speeds? Cold air, which we've depicted as molecules that are closer together and moving slower, or hot air, where the molecules are farther apart, but they're also moving faster? So take a moment to think about this for yourself and choose your vote for which you think is going to have a faster speed of sound. Well, there's clearly a trade-off between the distance away these molecules are and the speed that they're going, because remember, the way that sound travels is that molecules have to crash into their neighbors to transmit that sound energy and the vibrations as they go. So if they're closer, they should be sending speed faster, but if they're moving faster, they'll be able to hit the close by molecules faster. So there's a trade-off, and if we look at this here, the speed of molecules in sort of maybe a cold night for us here in Northridge is going to be, those molecules move about 500 meters per second. That's really fast. It's like faster than, it's like 1,000 miles an hour or something like that. So they're moving really quickly, but they don't have very far to go. They have only about 3.43 nanometers before they hit, on average, their neighbor. The hot air is moving faster, like 520 meters per second there, 519, but the spacing's a little bit farther. And if you look at those two numbers and you compare them, the hot air is moving 3.3% faster, but the molecules are only 2.3% farther apart. And so that means that if you look at those proportionally, the molecules are going to be able to hit their neighbors in a faster amount of time, quicker in the hot air. And so, in fact, we can figure out that hot air is where things travel quicker, and there's this kind of generic sort of statistical fit to the average speed of sound. That is, the speed of sound in air is about 331 meters per second plus 0.61 times the temperature in degrees C. And what we want you to do now is I'd like you to spend some moment here, to pause me in a moment, to calculate what is the speed of sound for three different temperature conditions, sort of a cold night in Northridge at 50 degrees to a hot day at 105 degrees. How will the speed of sound vary in those? And then also, we want to know kind of how much time that's going to affect things. So if a bat is echolocating, it's trying to bounce a signal off of a bug that's 5 meters away, that signal is going to have to travel 5 meters there and 5 meters back, so that's going to be 10 meters in total. So how long will that signal take at this speed, for this air temperature? And we'd like that not in seconds, like this equation will give you, but in in milliseconds, because it's going to be a really short amount of time. And in bat times, we usually talk about times in milliseconds for their calls. So go ahead and do that, and we'll talk about it in a moment. Hopefully you got something like this here. The 343 meters per second is the standard number that people use for the speed of sound if you're going to just assume that straight up for air, and that's because they're assuming that the air temperature is about 20 degrees. That's 68 Fahrenheit. And you can see the differences here are from 337 meters per second in the colder air to 355 in the warmer air. And what does that do in terms of the time? Well, it looks like it changes the travel time of that from about 28.1 milliseconds, 20.2, to 29.7. So we're looking at around 1.5 milliseconds different in travel time. So is that something a bat's going to be able to notice? It's not a very long amount of time, but if we look at one of their calls, like this is a relatively short call here. It's less than 5 milliseconds, but a bat, if their call in total is less than 5 milliseconds, I think that 1.5 or 1.7 or whatever that is, that time is something that a bat is going to be able to perceive. They're going to be able to perceive that much difference, and it's going to affect their echolocation. So I don't know much about this, but clearly bats are able to operate in different temperatures, so I'm guessing that they can probably do a little bit of that mental compensation as they're going along. So that was a fun curiosity question. A lot of the other questions involved things about identifying bats and trying to figure out if there was any cool signals in their echolocation calls. And so let's look at their echolocation calls in more detail. These are our 12 adopted bats that we have here, and we've got some really interesting bat signals in those. And what I ask people to do is to take a look at them very closely and compare them. What similarities do you notice? Things that you see in all 12 of these. What differences are there? Where do they have little bits of difference that you might be able to tell them apart from one another? And so kind of make a list of all of those and pause me. So we talked about all sorts of things like the height of these things, whether they're steep or flat, and they've got little things at the beginnings and ends of them in some cases. This one here goes on for a long time. Turns out that this thing at the end here, I think in most of these, is probably echo. That's not actually part of the bat's call. And so we want to kind of try and figure out what's the actual call that we'll be able to distinguish and what's a mediocre recording that we have. But other than that, you can see some of them have these little double bands in them here. Some of them have this little tail that goes down at the bottom. Some of them, that thing goes up. Some of them have this steep slope here at the beginning. So lots of differences that we're going to be able to notice. On the other side of the coin, these calls are all pretty darn similar. Every single one of them seems to start up high and go down low. Even these ones that are pretty flat, they still do that same thing. They have the same general shape. They sometimes have a little bit of a curvature to them. There's this very characteristic shape to them. And if you look at them from a distance, they don't look that much different. And when I say that, I'm comparing them to, say, another animal's calls, like bird calls, where you can see the huge variety in bird calls of the shapes that they produce, and even from birds that are really similar to each other. The one on the left is a little bit small, so let's zoom in on these options on the right here, which are very clear for us to see. There are 3 different types of thrush at the top here: the wood thrush, the olive-backed thrush, and the hermit thrush. They're all thrushes, which are all very similar birds, but look at the difference in calls that they're making. This one goes up, down, up, down, up, down. This one's got some ups and downs on a mountain-like thing with some other other sounds before and after, and this one just sort of seems to drone along at one frequency, jumps up to another, and keeps going at another one, and they're very different in their shape of their calls, whereas the bat calls all seem to have kind of a single shape of one direction going from top to bottom, and it's pretty crazy to think about. So why are bat calls all so similar with only slight variations on a single shape? Now, it's not because there's not a lot of variety in bats. Remember, there's 1,400 plus species of them. They're a quarter of all different mammals diversity. So this is clearly there's different types of bats, and yet they all have the same general call. And that's because these calls are serving a singular purpose. In birds, that purpose is a little bit different. The purpose is to distinguish one species from another and one individual from another. They're all trying to show off how beautiful and wonderful they are. So I showed these pictures of a beautiful male parrot and a rooster and a male peacock, and they're all trying to show that they are the best of that species to attract a potential mate. Whereas with bats, they're much more utilitarian. They have a specific purpose of function over form. And the function is going to drive what shape their call is going to be, because it has one specific task: to locate objects, obstacles, and prey. So I sort of give this a metaphor for this, that if you are trying to drive in a nail, you need a certain shape object to do that. This particular one looks like it'll do pretty well. So will this one. It's a little bit different shape, but it's kind of got the same general characteristics. Whereas if you try to use a shape like this one, a coat hanger, it's not going to work very well to hammer that nail in. It's a wonderful shape, super utilitarian, but not for this purpose. And so there's something about the shape of the bat's calls that serves their specific purpose, that helps them do their echolocation better. Which brings us to a question that we're going to answer later. We don't know all the things we need to yet, but why do all the calls go from a high frequency to a lower frequency? There's got to be something about that and the function that they need and the physics of sound waves that might be the answer to why all these have high to low. Well, I guess another reasonable question then is that why do the calls even differ at all? I mean, why aren't they exactly the same if they're all doing the same thing? And in biology, whenever you ask a why question, there's always one answer that will work every time. It's a little bit generic, but it's because it helps them survive, grow, or reproduce. So that is the answer to this question. However, the nuances and how does it help them do that, we're going to have to save for later when we learn a little bit more about how waves are traveling through the air. All right, let's talk about the spectrogram call, an individual call of a bat, and look at it in a little bit more detail and give us some vocabulary so that we can refer to different parts of it. Instead of that little part right there, we can say that the call has the following things. It has the characteristic frequency is kind of the most important thing about the bat calls, and that's the frequency that we say that's the last frequency before the tail, where the call is starting to flatten off and it's at its flattest point, and we label that as its characteristic frequency. The tail is that little part that goes either down at the end or up at the end, and some bat calls don't have very much of a tail, and others do. That connects the characteristic frequency to the low frequency, the lowest possible frequency that we observe in that bat call, which is opposite, of course, the high frequency, which is, in our case, is where these bats are always beginning their calls, in that upper section. And then you can talk about the range of frequencies from the highest to the lowest is called the bandwidth. So if the call has a lot of bandwidth, or a high bandwidth, then that means that it sweeps from a high frequency down to a low frequency. Whereas if it has a very low bandwidth, that means that it's kind of a flat call. Many of our calls have a bend between the upper section and the body, and that is called the knee. It's an inflection point. So sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the inflection point, which just means a change in slope. And kind of the last important thing to notice about the call is just how long it lasts, its duration, and we're going to be recording that as well. So these are all different parts of a call, and what I want you to do is to take this call here on our screen, or you can look at one of our adopted bats and to record a bunch of different statistics about it. I'd like you to record for our bats, we had our forearm length, our adopted bat, the high frequency, the characteristic frequency, and the duration. And also, we didn't see this in the plot before because I was just zooming in on one call, but what's the average time between calls? That could be useful and interesting for us. And so you can look at that from the attached PDFs and then enter them into this Google Sheet down here. So our teammates have all entered in all of their data into this Google Sheet. We're going to save the common name and 4-character ID for a little bit later, but what you can do here is we'd like to see some interesting things about this. So we're going to save these here, and what you can do with take a look at this and maybe take a screenshot, because we're going to go back to our thing here, and we want to sort the bats by their characteristic frequency. That's the number one criteria in distinguishing bat calls. And so I'll pop these up here, and here they are sorted by characteristic frequency. And we start from the high frequencies down to the low frequencies. Interesting. Okay, they have some ranges. There's some similarities to them. Let's take a look at another way of doing things. Let's instead sort by the duration of the call. As I flip back and forth between them, you'll see that there's not a huge amount of jumping around in here. There's a little bit of movement, but this call that's down here in the lower right, this one here, those stay in the lower right, regardless of whether we're looking at the characteristic frequency or the duration. Our call right here and some of these other ones, they sort of move around a little bit in that top row, but not so much. And then ones that are in the middle kind of stay in the middle, and they jockey around a little bit here, but there seems to be some sort of a correlation. And whenever we're looking for a correlation, we can actually look at that in a graph form, and it can help us spot those correlations. We're going to use a program called CODAP to determine which variables correlate. This is going to allow us to quickly take our Google data and plop it into a different website that makes it so we can plot graphs really fast and just change our axes really quickly so we can look for what a correlation should look like. And so I'm going to go ahead and show you that. here's our Google Sheet. I'm going to go ahead and select all the data in our Google Sheet, including that header row up there. I'm going to copy it. Actually, I think I need to do this on my operating system. I need to go edit, copy in the operating system. So let's do that. And then I'm going to go to a new tab, and I'm going to open up CodeApp. You can just do a Google search for it. It's called CodeApp, and it will eventually, when you get to the point where you can actually do things, you can create a new document. And right now we have a blank document. We'd like to get our data in there into a data table, and I can go up to the tables little icon up there and say new from clipboard, because we copied it into our clipboard, and let's see if it pastes it in. Look at that. There we go. Right away, it has the same data as our Google Sheet did. Then I'm going to ask it to create a graph. I can tap on that graph and it will create a new graph. And right now you can see the axes are blank, and so there's just a cloud of data. So we can ask things like, if we put our forearm axis on the horizontal axis, the forearm length on the horizontal axis, it will show you kind of a little histogram. It's not quite a true histogram, but it's stacking up each one of those data points there. Here's bat number 9 with its 55 millimeter forearm length. And here's our outlying largest bat, and our smallest bat was bat number 2. And so you can start seeing that there. But what if we asked if that correlated with something else, like, say, the time between calls? Well, that's a decent correlation. There's a few things that are maybe standing out a little bit, but overall, does the lowest forearm length, the smallest forearm length, correspond to the smallest time between calls, and the highest one correspond to the highest time between calls? It seems to do that. We can try other things, like the duration of the call. That's also a reasonably good correlation. If I ask for the high frequency, it's not quite as good a correlation. It's a little bit, spread out, and maybe has some. It's the opposite direction, which is okay. We can have inverse correlations. And so what I want you to do is basically go through this here, try all the different combinations that we have to see which ones correlate really well with each other and which ones don't. In fact, I'd like you to sort them into things that are a strong correlation, things that are kind of a medium correlation, and stuff that's weak or no correlation. And so we can discuss all the different combinations of things and try and figure out if there are any patterns in there that will help us understand something about bats. So go ahead and try that. One of the things we hope you noticed is that when you looked at body size, which is the forearm length, and compared that to frequency, there was a correlation. And this is true in just about and across all organisms. If we take our biggest animal that we know that makes a nice sound there, the elephants, their frequencies that they emit at are really low compared to, say, a really high mouse that squeaks at a high frequency, or a little tiny mouse. And other animals along the way tend to fall kind of along a relatively consistent pattern here. Now, our bats are off this general trend compared to other mammals there, but they have a correlation as well, where smaller bats make higher frequencies and larger bats make low frequencies. And so you can think about, why might that be? What could be causing that? Well, it makes sense because we're looking at the vocal cords vibrating, and if you have really small vocal cords, that's going to produce high frequencies. It's not going to take very long for them to vibrate back and forth, and so they're going to vibrate really quickly. And that means if they cycle around and vibrate many times a second, that's a high frequency. Whereas a larger vocal cord is going to take longer to swing back and forth, and it's going to operate at a lower frequency. And we can see that the frequency that these bats emit at is similar for bats that are closely related. If we look at one of these little evolutionary trees here and see the bats that are closely related tend to have colors that are similar to each other, representing their peak frequencies there. So that's not surprising that as bats are evolving from one another, they are from a common ancestor, that they will end up with relatively similar calls. So it makes sense that the body size affects the frequency, but how about the time between calls? That actually had a pretty good correlation with the bat size and time between calls. So why would that be? Well, let's go ahead and take a moment to watch a bat fly. Before we do, let's look here. These are all pictures that I Googled, and I asked for a bat flying, and it showed me these pictures. And of course, if you look at them, they all have a couple things in common, like their wings. What way are their wings oriented? Well, they're all up, because that makes a really cool picture, and that's, I think, why Google is favoring pictures with bats flying with their wings up, because it looks more interesting. The other similarity that you notice involves their mouth. What do you see about their mouth? In all these cases, their mouths are open. That's important. If they're going to echolocate, they need to have their mouth open, just like we do. We can't talk with our mouths closed, and same thing with them. So do they just go around flying with their mouths open the whole time? For that, we need to actually look at some videos of bats flying. So here we go. A bat gets released. Watch its mouth if you can. It's a little hard to see. See if its mouth stays closed or is open the whole time. And it may be going by too fast. So what I've done to help us is I have gotten it so that we have screenshots of what was going on there. So I'm showing here the direction the wing is going in each one of these arrows. So here the wing is down below, but it's on its way upwards. And the mouth is actually looking, to me, that looks like it's closed. The next screenshot I took is when the wing was up at going up higher. It's up, but it's also continuing to go up even higher, and the mouth is open pretty wide there. By the time the wing gets to its highest point, I took a screenshot, and its mouth is wide open. It's starting to bring those wings down. The mouth is still pretty wide open. Coming down a little bit further, mouth is still wide open. By the time the wing gets down below the midline, that mouth is starting to close again. You can see that is a mostly closed mouth by the time the wing is on its way back up again, but it's still below midline. Keep going here. It's on its way up. Mouth is starting to open again, really wide open when it's at its high point. It's coming down again, and it's still pretty wide open. Still pretty wide open as the wing comes down, and then when it gets below midline again, that mouth starts to close. So we're seeing a very consistent pattern. If you think about it, try this with your arms. Put your arms out like they're wings, and emulate the bat. Open your mouth wide when that bat has its wings up high. Close it as they get below midline. They're going to come back up again. Open, and you can see that bat's mouth is not always open. It's making its calls during certain parts of its wing beat cycle. Why would that be? Well, it tells us something that bigger bats seem to have their wing beat cycles spaced further apart. And that makes sense. If you've got big wings, it's going to probably be harder to flap them, so you're not going to move them up and down quite as quickly. So a big bat is beating its wings about this often here, like on the bottom, and a smaller bat is going to have its wings beating more often. They're easier to move around, and so we're seeing that here. We're actually seeing some evidence for that. And the reason why the bats' calls are synced up with their wing beats is because they actually have most bats have muscles that are basically connecting their vocal cords and their lungs in a certain way, such that as they push down with their wings, it also compresses their lungs and squeezes out the air. So basically, they can yell for free. It doesn't take any extra energy to expel the air to make really loud sounds, and so it's really easy for them to push out air. As they are flapping downwards, and that makes those loud echolocation calls. Now they can echolocate at other times during their wing beat cycles, but it's really the most energy efficient way to do it is when they are pushing out and pushing down. So the next time we get together, we're going to have to discuss which bat is which and use all those things that we noticed about how bats differ to help us figure out echolocation identification. So stay tuned for that. But before we do, we want to figure out, how do you create one of these diagrams here? We are going to work on coding up our very own versions of these spectrograms. How do you code a spectrogram? Let's find out. And to do it, we're going to use the programming language of R. For our homework assignment, we did some programming in Scratch, a cute little block coding language. It's a really great way to introduce the idea of programming, because you can get the idea that you're doing a sequence of events that kind of connect one after the other, and those what those blocks were for. And you can put particular commands within a block, like a repeat block in this case, and Scratch has these repeat 10 times. Well, R has the same sort of thing, but you have to do everything by typing it in manually in text here. And so to get something to repeat 10 times, you're going to write for I in 1 to 10, so the sequence of 1 to 10, it's going to do things. And then instead of having these nice little orange jaws that you can put things in between, you are going to have little curly braces, and you're going to put information or steps and commands within those curly braces, such that whatever is inside those is going to get repeated 10 times, just like whatever commands you slid inside the Scratch block codes was. Same thing with the if block. Scratch has one, R has one. So in the if block, you put within this little hexagon, it's a hexagon. You put within the hexagon some conditions, and if those conditions were true, then it did the stuff inside the big jaws. Well, the same thing is true with R. You can put if, and then instead of that hexagon, you put a parentheses, and you're going to put some conditions in there, like if the bat's wing is smaller than 10 millimeters, you'll do something. And so what will you do? You'll do the commands inside the curly braces. That same curly brace is repeated again to hold a block of code, just like the big jaws in the big orange jaws in Scratch were. Which means that you need to kind of get to know all of your punctuation, if you will, your curly braces, your parentheses, and your square brackets. And so we saw in the if statement there were the use of the parentheses, and that's where we're going to put parameters or conditions. So like an if statement, we're going to put the conditions inside. A for statement, which is the repeat command, the list to repeat. If we're going to call a function, which is you were able to do that in Scratch as well, where we had some custom functions. So every time you said turn left, it would do some things. Well, sometimes we can ask for it to do some things with giving it some information. Like we could have asked it to turn 90 degrees, and we'd put the 90-degree parameter inside of parentheses. We discussed in the orange blocks of code in Scratch, those are the curly braces, and those happen with if statements, with for statements, and the commands that we're going to do if we're going to define a function, we can put those inside of the curly braces there. Now, there's also use of square brackets there, and those help us usually when we are defining items in a list. A list in R is called an array, and arrays are sequences of numbers, a list of numbers, let's say. And so you might want to say, give me the third number on the list. And so you'd put the list's name and then the square brackets and then number 3 in there and close those square brackets. And notice how I said close them, because there's a thing at the top here that says that make sure every one of these that you have an open bracket or brace for, you also have a closed bracket or brace for, and that's because it's very easy to forget to do that, and it's one of the most common things when we're debugging, when we don't, R says sorry, I can't do that. I don't understand what you're telling me to do, is because you didn't close the bracket. So you've given it a block of code and you told it to start here, but it doesn't know when I'm supposed to stop doing that, and so you need to make sure you have those closed braces. So just like Scratch has that sort of thing on the left side where you can grab blocks of code from so you can see things, I've created this nice handout that has some common blocks of code that you can use in R. And what we did together is we started off to build a simple script in R that's going to load in a bat wave file and allow us to visualize it. And so that was our first step, was to load that up and visualize it. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video here, because that's something that's going to take us to work on together in